My name is Sarah Ruden, and I have kind of a long story. I'm going to try to keep it short right now. I was trained professionally in Latin and Greek at University of Michigan and Harvard, and I uh, took a job as my first and only academic job. I took a job at the University of Cape Town just as apartheid was ending. I was 10 years in South Africa. I had a an unbelievably useful and exciting experience then. I think South Africa saved me for practical life, and that's where I began my career as an author. I came back to the US. I learned Hebrew, and I had been translating Latin and Greek literature, classical literature, but coming back to the US, I began to uh, write about sacred literature, and my studies of Hebrew at Yale assisted in that. So that's more or less where I am right now. I have most recently um, published a new translation of the gospel. I am very happy to be here with you today, and I hope we'll have a wonderful conversation about many interesting angles on this text. Thank you for having me.
It's our privilege and our pleasure. It really is. Okay, so you came to my attention through my colleague Simon, who's in the room, because he brought your Gospels to me. And I am delighted to say that I had a really good look at them and they were fabulous. And I guess my first question for you really is that there are already lots and lots of translations of the Bible. We've got a whole 2 shelves of them at work. What made you decide to do a new one?
Well, I was troubled by several things over the years in traditional and mainstream translations of the Gospels, which I had known my whole life because I was raised as a Methodist in the U.S. So yeah, I was familiar with the King James version, with the Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, and so on. But the more Greek I learned, the more distressed I was about certain translation traditions that I thought were unsuitable. And with political developments in the US, I began to think that they were even dangerous and damaging to the community of believers and to others as well. I thought particularly that it was a problem that no one had ever addressed anti-Semitism in the original text of the Gospels. I think it's an enormous problem. I think it has been a license for Christian anti-Semitism over the centuries. So I wanted to come up with a really frank translation plus the appropriate footnotes to take account of that element. For example, in John 19:16, that's in the Passion story, um, it states they took him over to be hung on the stakes. That is, the Jews in Jerusalem, the Jewish hierarchy, took Jesus from Pontius Pilate and crucified him themselves. That is what John says. It's there's no way really around it. So I translate it quite literally. I add a shocked footnote in coordination with other footnotes on anti-Semitism. So that's just one thing that I think that both believers and non-believers should come to grips with in this text. I don't mean to be disrespectful toward the text. I don't mean to be um, imposing my progressive American politics, but I really think we ought to come to terms with what's actually there during this post-truth era. I was very, very lucky at Yale to have two teachers from the Jewish community uh, among my instructors, and they were fantastic. And one of them introduced me to the rabbinical tradition, but I had been quite familiar with the Jewish community from long before, and particularly in South Africa, um, where the Jewish community is very, very special and took a big role in opposing apartheid. So um, I was very, very happy to integrate more and more knowledge of the community with knowledge of their scholarly tradition, and um, make my own weak gestures at imitating them in their pluralistic and open-minded style of interpreting scripture. One problem that I had was simply with the quality and the style of the text. This is not a literary type of text, and I'm a literary translator. So I'm used to translating, say, Virgil in the very best style, in imitation of his exquisite Latin style. But that's not an appropriate approach to the Gospels, because they are what scholars would call subliterary. And um, also, the text is in a very bad shape. I would have to say a mess. So they were okay, all texts in the ancient world are hand copied, and they accumulate errors every time they're copied. So it's a sequential corruption, as they call it, of the text. And the Gospels, in part just because of their importance, are very, very corrupt. We have a laborious, very expert scholarly reconstruction into a standard Greek text. And of course, I relied on that. But sometimes the reconstructors, professional philologists, have simply not been able to come up with something coherent. So they leave the best of what they have. But what is a translator to do? Is she to fix it up? Make it coherent, smooth it out? I don't really think so. I kind of think that that's a falsification. So I did the absolute minimum of that I could. And when I didn't have something I was happy with, I noted in a footnote how problematic it was, rather than tidying it up and making it sound good and consistent.
So I'm sure Graham or Simon or Christine's got questions, but what Greek version did you use then? What were you working from? We've got a facsimile of the Codex Sinaiticus at work. It's a dirty, great, big, beautiful thing. Absolutely love it.
Ah, right. This is, and I've got it right here, just a second. This is the gold standard Nestle Aland Greek text. So this is a monumental German endeavor, and we get new editions of it every few years. So it represents the consensus of scholars about what the text most likely is. But what it is basically is a possible text. That is, the text accumulates all sorts of garbage. So you have, for example, monks during the Middle Ages copying, recopying, and they didn't have the scholarly resources we had, so they didn't understand a lot of what they were recopying. So they would copy in, for example, details about monastic institutions or the monastic day, things like that, when they didn't, say, understand some detail from Second Temple Judaism. They would just add something from their own words. So we throw all of that out. That's the easy part. And then you reconstruct something that people of this time and place, that is the first century AD and a little of the second, when the gospel writers were active. We're not sure where this thing was written, but it's around, around the Mediterranean somewhere. They're putting these texts together, and the text that we have reconstructed is something that they could have written. We're never sure. But if I could hold this up, here's the text in Greek, reconstructed text. And this is the book of John, which is the biggest mess. This is the apparatus criticus down below. And as you can see, the apparatus criticus is taken up about a third of the page. Sometimes it's half a page, sometimes it's a little more. The apparatus criticus is a list, highly, highly abbreviated, of the most plausible variants to the text that was adopted. So we have verse, say, 45 here. This is, oh no, this is Book of Luke. Sorry, that wasn't John. Book of Luke 24. And so we had verse 40. So down in the apparatus criticus, here are variations on verse 40 that we didn't choose. But they're important enough, they're plausible enough that we don't just throw them out, we show them to other scholars so they can be taken into account.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So the translator, who's relying on the scholarly consensus, can't feel very confident. You're still kind of hovering. You're still working with a hypothetical. In every verse you translate, you got to keep that in mind. And it's very odd. This is not at all like working with, say, Virgil or Aristophanes, nothing like that, where you pretty much got your text. So you are working on your sort of imaginary informed but imaginary reconstruction of many, many more learned people's informed yet imaginary reconstruction. Your head spins, especially when you think about the attitude of religious fundamentalists who say there's a single text, it is written on a rock with a bolt of lightning, it is God's absolute unitary word. Well, I'm looking at this and just sort of giggling, because which unitary word belongs to God and is God's authority alone?
That's absolutely fascinating. Does anyone in the room have any response to that, or emotional response, or anything? You're very welcome. Please do. Graham?
Yeah, I was wondering how, because you talk about imaginary reconstructions, and there's so many different variants of text, and how to translate it, and corruptions, and how does it affect your faith?
Well, you see, I'm a Quaker. So for Quakers, the faith is not tightly bound to the text. We say, our founder, George Fox, said, I tell you these things not as a rule or a form to walk by. That is from the 17th century, when the Quaker sect was founded. We have never believed that the Bible was an authority of absolute importance. It is certainly an authority of great importance, or it was to previous generations of Quakers, but we do not have the attitude toward it that other branches of Christianity do. So I think the work on this translation did not affect my Quaker Christian faith per se, because it simply did not depend on the text of the Gospels. For me, a text is an object. Language is an object. The human brain itself is an object. And we try, as far as, our imagination can manage, we try to separate these things, these objects, from our conception of God as love, as peace, as the protector of the universe. Does that help at all?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Excuse my ignorance surrounding Quakerism. I was just thinking, when you read, say, something Jesus said, do you not think, did he really say that, or did he say it differently, or and surely that must affect the way you read the Bible, the way you read the Gospels, because there's always doubt there, isn't there, about whether it's genuine.
Right. Yes. Um. When I consult historical studies, when I think about language, and when I, in my own feeble way, am trying to reconstruct some kind of possibility for what Jesus, in his incarnation, in his life on earth, would or would not have said, then of course it can be very confusing, both fascinating and confusing to me. But I think, I draw a certain inspiration, from that very uncertainty. Because if my faith had to rely on the work of human scholars, and especially on my own work, then I would not consider I would consider that faith to be in danger every time I opened a text of the Bible. Um, because, obviously, Jesus is shown in a different way in each gospel. He's shown using different wording in each different version of a gospel story. So again, if you want to say that this is some unitary work, you can't logically say this. And, I would be very, very disturbed, to have to think that, as American fundamentalists will tell you, that in showing all the variant versions of scripture, God is tempting us and using the gift of reason against us. That's a horrifying thought. I would say that's not my God. I am not going to twist and distort the reason God gave me to try to sort of cram all of these different versions of scripture into one baggy monster of a unitary version that all goes together. It doesn't go together because human understanding of God's will is faulty. We can't know, so we wrote these versions of scripture in an effort to know, but to have those versions turned back on us as some kind of a punishment would seem to me to be monstrous. We simply have to understand. We have to accept humbly our the limits of our understanding, the limits of the objects that we produce in an effort to get closer to God. We have to trust God to have love and pity for our efforts. That's my feeling about it.
Thank you.
Mm.
Can I ask an adjunct question to that? And that is, do you look at it the other way around, Sarah? Do you look at these texts, even supposing we take yours and we go with Sarah's text of Mark, do you look at that and go, I can celebrate what I think I've got to about this person and what this person is saying? In all the uncertainty, there's still something at the end of it that you have chosen to give us as an optional reading.
Oh, right. Yes. No, I, in the sense that I was in reading or trying to read the Gospels afresh, trying to pretend that I had never seen these in English. Great effort. Okay. But, I can read the Greek. So I was startled time after time at what the Greek actually said. And more often than not, I was inspired by it.
Mm.
For example, there is the matter of Jesus's confrontation with the Syro-Phoenician woman. That is, it happens in Tyre. She's Phoenician, so she's the ultimate pagan in the Jewish eyes. She is from a race of people who, at least in the past, were involved in child sacrifice. These are the people against whom the Jews defined themselves as they became monotheistic moralists. So in the Greek text, we have Jesus confronting her, and in the standard translations, all translations, as I understand, up to mine, he calls the Canaanites dogs.
Mm.
He says, it's not right to bother with you dogs, under the table, while the Jewish children are hungry. It's not. I forget how this exchange goes exactly, but you got to get the children fed. Those are Jewish children, and then we turn our attention to dogs. It sounds like a horribly insulting thing to come from Jesus's mouth, but that's not what the text says that he said. Not even close. He uses a diminutive, little doggies. It's a rare Greek word. It's used comically in pagan literature. It's used nowhere else in Greek scripture. And it's a very gentle, funny, kind of joshing way to remind this woman that her people are not Jews. And she answers right back. She throws that word back at him, and she says, well, even the little doggies get the crumbs. And in pagan context, and that's where she is, she's a Hellenist, the text says. She's in the Greek community, but she's also Phoenician. So this is a kind of cosmopolitan, non-Jewish community. Anyway, so she's familiar with the way that this word is used comically. So she throws it right back at Jesus. He says, well, even the little doggies, get some crumbs. And he more or less congratulates her. He grants her child a healing. And this atmosphere of contentment, almost of community, is created. And it's beautiful, and it all hangs on this one word. So I love it when things just emerge that way.
So in your reading, it goes from conflicting and aggressive and rude to kind of sassy and a dialogue of appreciation.
Yeah, a little bit abrasive, but he's also reaching out to her with that humor. And she reaches back to him. And it's one of those astonishing scenes in which Jesus confronts a woman and accepts something of her point of view. The woman at the well, that's another one, of course. So the woman caught in adultery, there's something of that there as well. So you have this gender element that comes into it as well. So you've got to think of the historical Jesus. He's a pious Jew in Palestine. Strange women are untouchable. Strange foreign women are doubly untouchable. Yet you have these confrontations. And the Syrophoenician woman is, she's at his feet. She's clinging to his ankles. So he's already in physical contact with her. And how does he handle this? She is, in ritual Jewish sense of the time, she's unclean. And you just have to get as far away from her as possible. You can't talk to her. But of course he engages with her. For me, it's an utterly beautiful scene on many levels. But you've got to take the literary point of view. You've got to take into account the tone and the style of the passage. And you got to do the hard work with your lexicons and see what's actually being presented to us. My consultant for this work confirmed to me that in this part of the Middle East, dogs were, basically the whole eastern part of the Mediterranean, dogs were not used for herding. So dogs were considered pretty much useless. They didn't work. So in places where the dog is used for herding, the dog has this great status from its collaborative work with human beings. Places like, England, Scotland, Ireland. But in Palestine, certainly, dogs didn't help you with any of your farm work. They lived in the street. They were in horrible shape, fleas, dirt. They were spreading other diseases. They mated in the street, and that was considered, of course, disgusting. And so you had, and dogs, they gnawed at corpses. They were like carrion birds. This made them sort of doubly unclean.
Sarah, that's absolutely fascinating. And what that absolutely shows is the power and strength of knowing your background in and around your translation. And what we found over and over again is just doing a Bible study with 2 or 3 different translations is an incredibly enriching experience. So that's really useful to hear the detail around that little doggy. Before we move on to the second challenge, I've got one more question that isn't scripted, and that's about humor. We tend to only hear these texts read in a somber or liturgical fashion, and yet actually they're crackingly full of humorous episodes and dialogue and interactions, but you don't tend to appreciate that. Did you have you got a comment on the humor in the translations that you've seen? Am I wrong about that, do you think? Or
Oh no, the Gospels are really quite funny. Um, there's black humor, there's a more lighthearted humor, there's every kind of humor in these works. One of the more glaring examples that I found was that um in the famous injunction to give your enemy, your opponent in law, your coat as well as your cloak. That's the way it's generally put. Um, the correct translation, the more precise translation of the Greek is your inner and your outer garment. You give both of those to your enemy. So that means you give him in this at the place where the judgment is taking place, in this public forum, um, you give him all the clothes you have. They didn't have underwear per se in the ancient world. So Jesus is telling his followers to strip down and to strip down clear to nudity. If you are challenged legally, that is, you're going to embarrass everyone. You're going to particularly embarrass your opponent by just giving him everything. Jews are very, in the ancient world especially, very puritanical. They did not strip down in public like the Greeks or the Romans did for athletics. None of that. So you're just creating the shocking scene by giving your opponent what he wants. And that's part of a message that we also find in Paul. Um, you give in to your opponent. You love your enemies, and that's gonna just, torture them, with it puts them in an impossible place. And I think Quakers certainly have some experience of this dynamic. Just don't fight them. Just don't fight the bully. Just sit down, do nothing. Here, if you want it, take it. Yeah, let me proceed to, challenge number 2. That was the challenge of imagining the first readers of this text, because it is a subliterary text. It's almost unique. You have a version of Koine Greek or street Greek, a sort of trade language, and we only really see it elsewhere in sacred literature. At least we see it in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from couple hundred years earlier than the Gospels. So we really don't have any context. This is the version read in the diaspora. We really don't have a sense of who these readers are. We have trouble contextualizing this particular text. So here's the gist of the problem here. We don't know whether most of the original readers understood what they were reading. They get this fresh text. Yeah, okay, it's kind of like a translation of the Jewish scriptures, fine, but it's so startlingly different in all of these ways. It's about this ordinary man who turns out to be the Son of God. Different topic altogether. And these weren't very learned, educated people. So those of them who didn't have direct connections to Palestine, they probably didn't understand what the text was telling them about Second Temple Judaism. And I'll give you an example. The Simon, son of Jonah, is rendered in Greek Simon Bariona, 2 words, Simon and then Bariona, which is just a transliteration of the Aramaic, and it means son of Jonah. Okay, but it's translated from Aramaic into Greek as if the person who translated it didn't understand what the Aramaic meant. So you have all of these elements of the local culture, which the authors of the Gospels apparently didn't understand. There are all kinds of sort of crude versions, actual mistakes, fumbling around with Jewish culture. So the separation, okay, the gap, between the Jewish, Aramaic, provincial, local culture with very important dependence on the rituals of the temple, got that on one hand. And then you have this sort of nebulous Greco-Roman, all Mediterranean literary culture, this incredible variety. You got that on the other hand. And then those two worlds are meeting in the Gospels, and they meet very awkwardly. So what is a simple translator to do? How do I unite the jagged edges where these two worlds are joining? Do I try to smooth things over like a traditional translator of the Gospels? My answer, of course, is no. I'm not going to pretend, these are smooth joints between the two cultures. I'm not going to do that. But I'm not going to produce English text that's so awkward that it's unreadable. So I produce something kind of in between and then put a footnote on it, kind of explain, why it doesn't make more sense in my text. That's how I do it. We're talking maybe 5th, 6th century or later. Until then, all literature was oral. If you're sitting alone in your study and you're reading a text, you read it out loud to yourself. If you're interacting with your scribe, that is all oral. There's no normal, quiet way to deal with literature. It is all oral, and the sound is incredibly important, much, much more than in our literature. So you have all of these, alliterations, you've got rhymes, you've got every kind of poetic and rhetorical device piled onto the text. And that's the case even in subliterary text like the Gospels, because they're not thinking with their eyes, they're thinking with their ears. It's a completely different interface with the world than what we're used to. We think of images. We got images, all over the place. Morning till night. That's our interface with the world. It is not the ancient interface. They're hearing things, and that's how they think of God. The midbar in Hebrew is the wilderness or the desert, but it means the place of hearing. All of the empty space outside town, its purpose really is for hearing God. Silence and emptiness is a space into which God's voice pours to enrich us and inform us and guide us. So, talk about difficult. I have, what's obviously kind of rough text, but it's also full of verbal games. It's full of music. And how do you express that? So I've tried, in my feeble way to reproduce alliteration if there is any, reproduce a rhyme if there is any, just kind of come up with some kind of an English analogy to show how very rich this text is and how well thought out it was. Because they had no idea of our standard, we say, if you've got something really important to say, don't goof around. Don't write a limerick about it. Use the plain language in your legal speech, for example, or in your scholarly work. Don't get fancy, because then we won't take you seriously. The ancients would say, are you kidding? The fancier the text, the more it's evident how hard you've worked on it, how much you care about it, and how the people listening to it should pay attention and remember, using the sound of the text to help them.
So I don't know if Simon or Graham or Christine wants to say anything to this particular bit. Oh, Simon's leaning. Go on, Simon. Simon, just keep us on task.
To me, it's fascinating. You come from translating classical Greek, Homer, Virgil, and those people, Aristophanes, etc. Do you think that any of the gospel writers were significantly influenced by those texts, because they'd be like quoted in court cases in the Greek world, in particular?
Well, that little bit, of introduction to Luke, the dedication to his sponsor, his patron, if you will. That's a long, as we say, periodic sentence. That's the kind of thing that you would write if you were quite well educated, schooled in rhetoric, as all men of substance were in the ancient world. So I would not have any trouble saying that, yes, Luke had the standard education. He had read the pagan canon. He, at least in Greek, he really knew what he was talking about. It's harder to pin that down for the other gospel writers. I would say that's definite for Paul. Paul had a standard rhetorical education. I'd bet my life on it. And then he was packed off to the Jerusalem temple, to get his, that was his Jewish higher education. So, but he was raised among pagans and had that education, I am certain, though it was a Jewish household he was brought up in. But the diaspora, straddled that difference without any problem at all.
Thinking about the original hearers of the Gospels, and you mentioned earlier anti-Semitism, and John's Gospel might have been written late, when the church and the synagogue had split and they were now sort of enemies. And there does seem to be anti-Semitism in there. And when you translate that, rather than smoothing it over, if you're translating it as it's written, does that not make you feel uncomfortable that you might increase anti-Semitism today? I mean,
Right. Yeah, no, the anti-Semitism in the Gospels makes me extremely uncomfortable. What I do to try to mitigate that in my translation is to include plenty of footnotes and point out where, especially where I think the anti-Semitism is a later accretion, because the big event that we have to think about in terms of anti-Semitism in the first century is, of course, the sack of the temple in 70 AD. So we are not certain about the date of composition of any of the Gospels, but it is possible that all three of the earlier ones, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, were written when Palestine or Judea had already exploded in violence. This is several years before the sack of the Roman sack of the temple. So there was a major Jewish rebellion. It was put down at first inadequately, and then Rome threw against this rebellion the full might of its military. So the temple was reduced to one wall, the so-called Wailing Wall that's standing today. It was nearly leveled. There was a horrific massacre of Jews in Jerusalem. Many thousands were sold into slavery abroad. So traditional temple Jewish culture was annihilated. And what emerged slowly in the aftermath was rabbinical culture around synagogues in the diaspora, all over the Mediterranean. And of course in Judea too, as Judea recovered. Um, uh, and during the rebellion, in particular after the fall of the temple, Jewish Christians were, let's say, Jewish followers of Jesus, because Christian is originally a pagan name for followers of Christ. Jewish followers of Jesus wanted to dissociate themselves with traditional Judaism. So my strong feeling is that cruel remarks about the Jews, the depiction of Jews as at fault in the crucifixion of Jesus, elements like this owe the most to Christians' fear that they would be associated with Jews and persecuted and pursued along with them in this particularly difficult period for Jews, which extended, by the way, into the 130s, because a second big rebellion, Bar Kokhba's rebellion, was not suppressed until then. So you have truly horrible few decades for Jews, during which time Christians are apparently backing up and saying, no, not us. And the very weird thing that can emerge in the Gospels is that Jesus is depicted in particular phraseologies as if he were not Jewish. So again and again we hear, and even in earlier Gospels, we hear Jesus as if he were not Jewish. So Jesus went here, he did that, he made this situation, he made this statement, or he did this thing, he performed this healing, so on and so forth. And if we look at the Talmud, we see that he's doing this already in rabbinical terms. So he's very much, historically, we can see that he's elucidating Jewish principles, for example, about the Golden Rule. Don't get that from the pagans, for sure. Anyway, the way it's written up later on, so decades after his life, but with the Jewish clash with the Romans being very much in the news, we see Jesus the non-Jew. We see him doing this, saying that, and then the Jews confront him. Or he has to hide because he's afraid of the Jews. Or the Jews go after him. And it's not really clear what's in the gospel author's minds. Do they mean the temple hierarchy? Do they mean more conservative Jews, there are ascetic Jews, they're Jews who are sort of a Greek philosophical kind of character. So, but we don't know. It just says the Jews. And it's plainly attempting to insinuate that he was not one. And that is the kind of idea that passes into the Middle Ages and contributes to horrific persecutions of the Jews and the blood libel and pogroms and expulsions of Jews from entire countries. And I do believe that by late antiquity, the wool was pulled over people's eyes, and people were actually thinking, no, he was not Jewish, or it never occurred to him that he was Jewish. He was something else. Because look, in the Gospels, there are Jews and Jesus. There are Jesus and his followers, and then there are Jews. And yeah, you see him celebrating the Passover and stuff, but people with an animus against Jews would be able to seize on the anti-Semitic passages very easily because, of course, the Gospels, this was a time of very, very widespread illiteracy. Gospels were not read in Western Europe. They weren't read in the original at all. All you had was this Latin version that some of the clergy had access to. But, there was nothing to correct anti-Semitic notions. The blonde Jesus is not only the Jesus of Hollywood films, he is the Jesus of ordinary Christians' understanding. And we can see that from the very time that they began to have images of him. Because Jesus is pictured as a semi-nude young man. It's either an Apollo figure, blonde flowing hair, or a Dionysus figure. Again, a young man, pale, kind of fleshy, but very much the Greco-Roman conception of a rather effeminate male beauty. It's just bizarre when you start to look at these images. But they had, as far as they could, they had blanked out the Jewish Jesus, who would have been dark, probably dark, bearded. These are beardless young men, signifying that they are almost adolescent. It, of course, would have been dark, bearded. He certainly wouldn't have been semi-nude, just this little cloak, maybe, little loincloth. No. He would have been, well covered in the traditional wool garments, as a pious Jew of that time. Paul had a lot to sort out, culturally and intellectually. So he was, I think quite well assimilated to Greco-Roman society, but, as a pious Jew, and he emphasizes that he was one, he would have been, raised to the proper ritual observances, which were quite strict. Not only was he, of course, circumcised, but he couldn't have table fellowship as a proper Jew with non-Jews. He, of course, contact with non-Jewish women was out of the question. So we don't know about, whether he was ever married or not, but it was unthinkable that he raised as he was, would have been allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman. But he saw, his converts as non-Jews, as ordinary pagans. And so he wanted to make it possible to proselytize among them, because they circumcision was considered a horrible mutilation among the Greeks and Romans. So very, very tiny percentage would have been so committed to following Jesus, to the extent of having themselves circumcised as adults. But he had Timothy circumcised. Timothy, who had a mixed parentage, one parent Jewish, one not, was apparently up to this, but Timothy was very likely extremely committed follower. Anyway, for the rank and file of people he wanted to convert, no, this was out of the question. Nor did they want to lose table fellowship. It basically meant losing your Gentile family. If you can't sit down and eat with people, they're not your family anymore. So he was more or less trying to square the circle and saying, what's the value of being Jewish? It has great value indeed, of course, and Jewish law, tremendous value in that, it brings, this is the sort of corridor through which Jesus comes to us. And he was, trying to persuade, or obviously trying to discourage anti-Semitism at the same time as opening up the new sect to all believers. That is, anyone who had faith and was willing to be baptized should be eligible to be a follower of Jesus. He was very committed to this, but I think, from the way that I read his letters, he was much more successful in some passages than in others, in some arguments than in others, in some communities than in others, in coming up with a formula and with an actual set of practices that would work. He worked from synagogues outward, into the non-Jewish community. The synagogues were not always happy about that. Very, very complicated set of questions. Fascinating character whom I try to get a little closer to through my book, Paul Among the People.
What would you want people to bear in mind when they read any translation of scripture? And it could be that you return to your earlier point about the layers of layers, but how would you like people to read this? How would you like them to respond to this?
At the risk of being thought irreverent, still a little COVID fog there.
COVID.
I would ask them to very respectfully think of whatever translation or whatever text they're dealing with as a thing. And that's not speaking to degrade that thing. All parts of creation are holy. So God made the physical materials of which our sacred literature is made. God gave us our senses. God gave us our brains. God reveals the divine self as God chooses, and the divine will as God chooses. But since we're human beings, it can only be, revealed through the physical objects of sound, writing, the human body, that produces these. So, think of the Gospels as just a thing, in that we don't have, we don't have access to God's. We're human beings. We don't have access to God's essence at our own will. But if we think of our study as a form of prayer and a form of approach to God, then I think it contributes to our humility in, asking for God's will to be revealed to us, while still, being cognizant that we don't have the lowdown. We are only always asking. And thank you so much for your company, for your conversation, which I do think I've hogged. It's been a wonderful time. Thank you so much. And I feel in the present politics, in the present state of the world, I feel now so encouraged